The shuttle descended through Earth's atmosphere with a grace that seemed almost apologetic. Ambassador watched through the viewport as the blue planet grew larger, its surface marked by the geometric patterns of cities and the wild sprawl of nature. He had visited 47 worlds in his 3 centuries of diplomatic service, but none had filled him with such an odd mixture of hope and unease. "They are primitives," his military advisor commander said from behind him. Thus 4 eyes blinked in sequence, a sign of deep skepticism. "Their faster-than-light technology is barely 100 rotations old. They have not even unified their own planet." "That is precisely why we are here," replied his translator, rendering his words in the clicks and harmonics of his native tongue before converting them to human English. "The Concordat has been unified for 3,000 years. We have forgotten things these humans still remember." The shuttle landed at a military complex in what the humans called Colorado, had studied the location carefully. It was buried inside a mountain, protected by layers of rock and metal. The humans, he noted, still built their important facilities to withstand attack. The Concordat had not designed a military structure with defense in mind for longer than most species kept records. General Sarah waited for them in a conference room that smelled faintly of recycled air and something the humans called coffee. She was smaller than had expected, her hair cut short in a practical style, her uniform decorated with colorful ribbons that denoted various achievements. Her eyes were dark and sharp, and they studied the alien delegation with an intensity that made Evan's translator pause. "Ambassador," she said, extending her hand in the human gesture of greeting, took it carefully, mindful of his species' greater strength. "We received your preliminary reports. I won't insult you by pretending we're not surprised by your request." "We are surprised to be making it," admitted as he settled into a chair designed to accommodate various body types. "The Concordat has maintained peace through superior technology and coordinated defense for. The Void Swarm has made both advantages meaningless." Pulled up a holographic display. The technology was crude compared to Concordat standards, flickering slightly at the edges, but it showed what mattered. The Void Swarm appeared as a dark mass spreading across a star map, consuming everything in its path. "A hive intelligence," said, her fingers manipulating the display. "Adaptive learning, no individual units, perfect coordination. You hit them with plasma weapons, they adapt shields in hours. You use kinetic strikes, they redistribute mass to absorb impacts. You try electronic warfare, they evolve new communication methods faster than you can disrupt them." "Precisely," said. "Our AI combat systems have run 100,000 simulations. In 97,000 scenarios, the Concordat suffers casualties exceeding 60% of our military forces. In the remaining scenarios, we lose slower but still lose eventually." Stepped forward, his crystalline exoskeleton chiming softly. "We have advantages the swarm cannot match. Our weapons are more powerful, our shields are stronger, our ships are faster, yet every engagement proves catastrophic. They learn from every encounter, adapt to every tactic. By the 3rd battle, they counter every strategy we employ." "Because you fight fair," said quietly. The room fell silent. Translator struggled with the phrase, offering 3 different interpretations before settling on one. He was not sure he understood correctly. "Fair?" he asked. Stood and walked to the window overlooking the mountain facility. Below, could see human soldiers running in formation, their movements synchronized but somehow less perfect than the Concordat's training regiments. "Your species achieved interstellar travel 3,000 years ago," said. "You met other species, formed the Concordat, established peace through mutual cooperation and overwhelming technological superiority. When conflicts arose, you resolved them through negotiation or, rarely, through demonstrations of force so decisive that resistance became pointless. You have not fought a real war in recorded history." "This is true," agreed. "It is our greatest achievement." "It's your greatest weakness," said, turning back to face them. You fight like chess masters. Every move calculated, every strategy optimized, every resource allocated for maximum efficiency. The Void Swarm is also fighting like a chess master, except it's better at it than you are because it can process millions of calculations simultaneously and learn from every mistake instantly. Exoskeleton chimed in aggressive tone, and humans are somehow superior strategists. No, said, we're worse, much worse, but we've been fighting each other for our entire history and we've learned something you haven't. She pulled up a new display showing human history. Battles flickered past, thousands of them spanning. Saw primitive humans throwing rocks, then spears, then arrows. He saw them wielding swords and guns and missiles. He saw them fighting on land, sea, air, and eventually space. An unbroken chain of violence stretching back to when humans lived in caves. We learned to cheat, said. We learned that when your enemy is stronger, you don't fight their fight. When your enemy is smarter, you don't play their game. When your enemy can predict you, you become unpredictable. You lie, you deceive, you sacrifice pawns to take queens. You make your enemy think you're doing one thing while you do another. You make them afraid of shadows. Felt something cold settle in his chest. You are describing dishonor. I'm describing survival, corrected. Look at your simulations again. You're fighting the swarm the way it expects to be fought. Logical deployment of forces, optimal firing solutions, efficient resource management. The swarm adapts because your strategies are predictable. Even when you introduce random elements, you're still operating within parameters of logical military doctrine. She pulled up footage from one of the Concordat's battles with the swarm. Watched as his people's beautiful, coordinated fleet movements were systematically dismantled by an enemy that anticipated every maneuver. You retreat when retreat is logical, continued. You advance when advance offers advantage. You protect valuable assets and sacrifice expendable ones according to calculated risk assessments. The swarm reads all of this because it makes sense. It's what any rational military force would do. And humans do not operate rationally? Asked, his tone making it clear this was not a compliment. In war, we operate within controlled irrationality, said. We attack when we should retreat. We sacrifice valuable pieces to save worthless ones. We waste resources on decoys and false objectives. We make our enemies so busy predicting our logical next move that they miss the illogical one that actually matters. She brought up another human battle, something from their Second World War. Watched as human forces created an entire fake army, complete with inflatable tanks and false radio traffic, to convince their enemies they would attack in one location while they prepared to attack in another. Operation Fortitude, explained. We made the enemy think our main invasion would come at Calais when we planned to attack Normandy. We spent months building elaborate lies. We sacrificed resources and time to maintain deception. And because our enemy was trying to predict the logical move, they missed the real one. The swarm would not fall for such tricks, insisted. It would detect the deception. Maybe, agreed. Or maybe it would be so busy analyzing our fake signals and false movements that it would miss the real threat until too late. The point isn't that any single trick will work. The point is that if you fight the swarm the way you've been fighting it, you lose. You need to fight it the way we've learned to fight, through thousands of years of coming up with desperate solutions against impossible odds. Stared at the human general for a long moment. His people had spent 3,000 years building a civilization based on logic, cooperation, and the efficient allocation of resources. Now this human was telling him that to survive, they needed to embrace chaos. What you are proposing, said slowly, is that we relearn warfare, not as we know it but as humans practice it. Yes, said. This will be difficult for my people. We have not thought like predators for a very long time. His expression softened slightly. I know, and I'm not saying we're better than you. We're not. You built a peaceful civilization that spans hundreds of worlds. We can barely keep peace on our own planet, but right now you don't need philosophers or diplomats. You need soldiers who remember how to fight dirty. Looked at, then back at. He thought of the void swarm spreading across the galaxy, consuming everything. He thought of the Concordat's beautiful ships being torn apart by an enemy that learned faster than they could adapt. He thought of his people, who had forgotten the taste of fear. How long would this training take? He asked. For your commanders to understand the basics, weeks. For them to truly internalize it, months, maybe longer. Your people have spent thousands of years training themselves to think one way. We need to teach them to think another way, at least when it comes to fighting this enemy. We may not have months, said quietly. The swarm advances daily. Then we start immediately, said. She pulled up a list of human military officers. I'm assigning advisors to each of your command ships. They'll work with your captains and strategists. Some of what they teach will seem wrong to you. Some of it will seem wasteful. Some of it will seem cruel. But it's kept humanity alive when we had every reason to go extinct. Stood, his tall frame unfolding with the grace of his species. The Concordat Council will not approve of this easily. Many will see it as corrupting our values. I'm not trying to corrupt anything, said. I'm trying to keep you alive. The void swarm doesn't care about your values. It doesn't negotiate. It doesn't stop. It just consumes. And right now, logic and honor aren't enough to stop it. She extended her hand again and took it. Her grip was firm, confident. In her eyes, he saw something the Concordat had lost long ago, something that humanity had never been able to abandon. The understanding that survival sometimes requires doing things that civilized beings find distasteful. We accept your offer, General said. Teach us to fight like humans. Then let's begin, replied. Because the swarm isn't going to wait for us to get comfortable with being uncomfortable. As the meeting concluded and plans were set in motion, looked out at the human soldiers training below. They moved with purpose, shouting commands to each other, pushing themselves beyond comfort. They had been doing this for thousands of years, refining the art of war while the Concordat refined the art of peace. Now, the galaxy would learn which art mattered more when facing extinction. The training facility in the Arizona desert looked like every human military base had visited over the past 3 weeks, functional, efficient, and somehow intimidating despite its lack of advanced technology. Concordat officers stood in neat rows, their various species creating a rainbow of colors and forms under the harsh Earth sun. They had arrived expecting to learn human weapon systems or tactical formations. What they got instead was far more unsettling. General stood before them, his weathered face showing no sympathy for their discomfort. Behind him, a holographic display showed a simple military scenario. 2 forces facing each other across a battlefield, one clearly superior in numbers and firepower. You are the smaller force, said in his heavily accented English, which the Concordat's translators rendered into dozens of languages simultaneously. You have 1,000 soldiers. Your enemy has 5,000. You have 10 weapons platforms. They have 50. What do you do? Commander stepped forward, his crystalline exoskeleton reflecting the desert light. We fortify our position, maximize our defensive advantages, and request reinforcements while inflicting maximum casualties on the advancing force. You lose, said flatly. You lose slowly, efficiently by the numbers. Your defensive position is overrun in 6 hours. 90% casualties. Next. An officer raised one of her 6 arms. We retreat to a more defensible position and use our mobility to strike at their supply lines. Better, acknowledged. You lose in 12 hours instead of 6, still dead. Next. The officers looked at each other, confusion rippling through the ranks. These were not stupid beings. They represented the finest military minds of species that had mastered interstellar travel. Yet the human general dismissed their answers as if they were children reciting badly learned lessons. No one asked. Then I tell you what humans do, we surrender. The word hung in the air like a curse. Several officers made sounds of disgust or disbelief. Exoskeleton chimed in angry tone. You teach us cowardice, demanded. I teach you survival, replied calmly. We send forward negotiators under white flags. We waste their time with talks. Meanwhile, our real force, the one we hid before the battle, circles around and attacks their actual target, their command center, their supply depot, their home base. By the time they realize our 1,000 soldiers were never meant to win the battle, we have already won the war. He changed the display to show human soldiers in ancient times doing exactly what he described. Fake retreats, false surrenders, anything to make the enemy believe they were winning until the real trap closed. This is deception, an admiral protested. This violates every principle of honorable warfare. Honor does not stop the swarm, said. The swarm does not surrender. It does not negotiate. It does not respect flags or treaties, but it does learn patterns. So we teach you to have no patterns. We teach you that winning is the only honor that matters when extinction is the alternative. Over the following days, the Concordat officers learned lessons that challenged everything they understood about warfare. Admiral taught them about asymmetric warfare, using small, cheap assets to destroy large, expensive ones. She showed them how ancient human sailors in small boats defeated massive warships, how guerrilla fighters with primitive weapons held off technologically superior armies, how disadvantage could become advantage with the right thinking. You have better ships, explained, better weapons, better shields. The swarm adapts to all of it. So stop using your advantages the way the swarm expects. Use one advanced warship to protect 10 primitive ones. The swarm will adapt to the primitive ships, waste resources analyzing them, while your real weapon strikes from an unexpected angle. Colonel, a tall human from Nigeria, taught them about psychological warfare. He showed them battles where humans had won not through superior force, but through making their enemies afraid, uncertain, demoralized. The swarm is a hive mind, said. It does not feel fear, but it does calculate threat assessment, make it see threats everywhere, broadcast false signals, launch attacks that serve no tactical purpose except to make it wonder what purpose they serve, make it spend computational resources trying to predict your strategy when you have no strategy, only chaos directed at keeping it off balance. But the hardest lessons came from General herself. She assembled the senior Concordat officers in a private session and showed them something that made several of them physically recoil. Human casualty reports from their various wars. The numbers were staggering. Thousands dead in single battles, millions over the course of campaigns, entire generations of young humans sent to die for objectives that, in hindsight, sometimes seemed barely worth the cost. This is horror, said quietly. How do you live with such loss? We don't live with it easily, replied. We carry it, we remember it, we build monuments to it, but we accept it as the cost of survival. And that's what you need to learn. Sometimes you have to spend lives to save lives. She pulled up a tactical scenario, similar to ones they had been running for weeks. A Concordat fleet facing the Void Swarm. In every simulation, the Concordat commanders tried to minimize casualties, to save as many ships and crew as possible, and in every simulation they lost. Watch, said. She ran a new simulation, this one with human tactics. A squadron of ships broke formation and flew directly at the swarm, weapons blazing, shields minimal. They were destroyed in minutes. But while the swarm was busy analyzing that seemingly suicidal attack, the main fleet executed a complex maneuver that would have been impossible if the swarm had been paying attention. The simulation ended with the swarm in retreat and the Concordat forces victorious. You sacrificed an entire squadron, said, his voice hollow. 300 lives. To save 3,000, replied. That's the math. That's the choice. Every human commander in this room has had to make it at some point in their career. Most of us live with nightmares about it, but we make the choice because the alternative is everyone dies. My species does not reproduce quickly, a admiral said softly. Our children take decades to mature. Every life lost is a generation delayed. We cannot make such choices lightly. You think we do? Asked. Every name on those casualty lists was someone's child, parent, friend, lover. But war doesn't care about our feelings. It only cares about who survives and who doesn't. The void swarm will kill all your children if you lose. Better to sacrifice some now in a way that gives the rest a chance than to lose them all trying to save everyone. The room was silent for a long moment, then spoke, his voice weary. We came to you because we had no other choice. I see now that the lesson you teach is harder than we imagined. You are not teaching us tactics. You are teaching us to think like a species that has never known peace long enough to forget the cost of war. Yes, agreed. That's exactly right, and I'm sorry for it. I wish the galaxy were different. I wish you didn't have to learn these things. But the swarm is coming and wishes don't stop it. She stood and walked among the assembled officers, her small human form moving between beings twice or three times her size. Here's the truth, she said. Humanity isn't special. We're not smarter than you. We're not braver. We've fought each other for thousands of years not because we're noble warriors, but because we've been too divided, too stubborn, too scared of each other to build what you built. Your civilization is better than ours in almost every way. But you've forgotten something we never got to forget. Sometimes survival requires doing terrible things. Sometimes the only way to protect what you love is to be willing to sacrifice part of it. She stopped and looked at directly. The question isn't whether you can do this. The question is whether you will, because the swarm is going to reach the Concordat's core worlds in 3 months. And if you're not ready to fight dirty by then, everything you've built over 3,000 years will be gone. The training continued through the following weeks with renewed intensity. The Concordat officers began to change, slowly at first, then more rapidly. They stopped trying to optimize every decision and started introducing deliberate inefficiencies. They practiced false retreats until they could execute them without their instincts screaming at them to stand and fight properly. They ran simulations where they accepted casualties they once would have considered unacceptable. Watched his people transform and felt both pride and sadness. They were learning quickly, adapting their naturally superior cognitive abilities to this new way of thinking. But in doing so, they were losing something of what made them who they were. They were becoming harder, more willing to make cold calculations, more comfortable with the mathematics of sacrifice. One evening, he found standing alone, looking out at the desert sunset. The Earth sky was beautiful in a way that seemed almost aggressive, bright oranges and reds that demanded attention rather than the soft pastels of his. "General," he said, "may I speak freely?" "Always," replied. "I find myself wondering if we will still be who we were after this is over, if learning to think like humans might change us permanently." Was quiet for a moment, watching the sun sink toward the horizon. "Maybe," she admitted. "War changes people, changes civilizations. We've got thousands of years of evidence for that. But here's what I believe. You're not becoming like humans. You're becoming like any species that faces extinction and chooses to survive. The capacity for this was always in you. You just didn't need it for a long time. And when the swarm is defeated, will we remember how to be who we were?" "I don't know," said honestly. "But I know which problem I'd rather have, figuring out how to rebuild your peaceful civilization after you win, or not having a civilization left at all because you lost." Nodded slowly. She was right, of course, but the knowledge brought no comfort. "The first combined fleet exercises begin tomorrow," said, changing the subject. "Your people will command ships with human advisors embedded in every critical position. It's going to be messy." "Everything about this has been messy," replied. "Perhaps that is the point." "Perhaps," agreed. "The swarm expects order, we'll give it chaos. The swarm expects logic, we'll give it contradiction. The swarm expects us to fight the way we've always fought. We'll fight the way we've never fought before. She turned to face him, and in the dying light saw the weight she carried. This human general who spoke so casually about sacrifice and casualties and doing terrible things. She bore the cost of every lesson she taught. "Thank you," General said, "for sharing your pain with us." "Let's just hope it's enough," replied. "Because the swarm is coming and hope isn't a strategy. It's just what we hold on to while we execute the plan." As night fell over the desert, Concordat and human forces prepared for the trials ahead. The galaxy's most peaceful civilization was learning to wage war from its most violent. And somewhere in the darkness between stars, the Void Swarm continued its inexorable advance, unaware that its greatest advantage was about to become its fatal weakness. The Threshold Nebula burned with colors that had no names, a cosmic storm of gases and stellar debris that marked the edge of Concordat space. It was here that the Void Swarm would arrive, pouring through the gravitational channels that connected this region to the dark spaces beyond. And it was here that the combined fleet waited, 300 Concordat vessels supported by 50 human ships, all commanded by officers who had spent the last 2 months learning to think in ways their ancestors would have found incomprehensible. Stood on the bridge of the flagship Harmonious Dawn, watching displays that showed the fleet in formation. Except it was not really a formation. To any military analyst, it would look chaotic. Ships clustered randomly, gaps in coverage, weapon systems oriented in directions that made no tactical sense. It looked like a force that had no idea what it was doing. That was the point. "Fleet positions confirmed," Commander reported from his station. His exoskeleton no longer chimed with disapproval when he read the tactical displays. He had learned, painfully, that what looked like disaster to his ordered mind might be victory to the unconventional thinking humans had taught them. "All vessels report ready. Human advisors are in position." On his right, Major Rachel Torres stood with her hands clasped behind her back. The human officer had been assigned as his primary advisor, and over the past weeks, he had learned to trust her instincts even when they contradicted everything he understood about warfare. "They'll come through in waves," Torres said, studying the nebula's edge. "The swarm always does. First wave to probe defenses, second to exploit weaknesses, third to overwhelm. They've done it in every engagement with the Concordat. So they expect us to respond the same way the Concordat has responded before," said. "Concentrated fire on the first wave, repositioning to cover exposed areas, then fighting retreat when the numbers become overwhelming." "Right," Torres agreed, "which is why we're going to do the opposite of all of that." The waiting was the hardest part. Minutes stretched into hours. The fleet maintained its apparent disorder, with ships occasionally breaking position for no apparent reason, moving to new locations that offered no obvious advantage. Several times saw his own officers tense, their instincts screaming that something was wrong, that they needed to correct these errors. But they held position. They trusted the plan, even though the plan seemed designed to fail. Then the sensors screamed warnings, and the Void Swarm arrived. They came through the nebula's edge like a dark tide, thousands of organic ships that conventional design. They had no obvious engines, no clear weapon systems, nothing that looked like what a ship should look like. They simply existed, black, writhing masses that moved with purpose and intelligence. The first wave numbered perhaps 2,000 units, each the size of a Concordat frigate. They poured through the gravitational channel and immediately began their tactical assessment. Could almost see the hive mind working, analyzing the fleet's positions, calculating optimal attack vectors, preparing to exploit the obvious weaknesses in the Concordat formation. "All ships," said, his voice steady, "execute Protocol Chaos 1. What happened next would have gotten any Concordat officer court-martialed a month ago. A squadron of ships at the fleet center suddenly fired their weapons. not at the swarm but into empty space, expending expensive ammunition on nothing. Another group of ships broke formation and retreated at maximum speed, broadcasting distress signals that indicated catastrophic damage despite suffering none. A third group simply shut down their shields and went dark, as if their systems had failed completely. The void swarm paused. Its advance slowed as the hive mind processed this unexpected behavior. Ships firing at nothing, ships retreating when not engaged, ships going offline without being attacked. None of it made sense. None of it fit any pattern from previous Concordat encounters. "Second wave incoming," Torres said calmly. "Right on schedule." The swarm sent more units through, these ones larger and more heavily armored. They moved to exploit what should have been obvious weaknesses: the gaps in coverage, the ships that had gone dark, the scattered formation that left vessels isolated and vulnerable. They attacked with the precision that had defeated every Concordat force they had encountered. And then the trap closed. The ships that had gone dark blazed back to life, their weapons firing at point-blank range into swarm units that had moved close to finish easy kills. The vessels that had retreated suddenly reversed course, coming in from unexpected angles. The ships that had fired into empty space had actually been launching specialized mines that now activated, creating a web of energy disruption that the swarm had never encountered before because the Concordat had never been wasteful enough to deploy them preemptively. "Now the real formation," ordered. "Execute strike pattern 3. The chaos resolved into purpose. What had looked like disorder revealed itself as misdirection. The Concordat fleet had never been randomly positioned. Every seemingly wrong placement had been carefully calculated to make the swarm think it understood the battlefield when it understood nothing. Ships that had appeared isolated were actually positioned to create crossfire zones. Gaps in coverage were actually kill boxes. Weapons pointing in wrong directions were actually aimed at exactly where the swarm would be once it committed to attacking the false weaknesses. The void swarm reeled. Its hive mind had optimized its tactics based on false information, and now it was dying in droves, but knew this advantage would not last. The swarm would learn. It would adapt. That was what it did. "Third wave coming," Torres warned. "This one will be different. They'll adjust for what we just did." "Good," said. "Execute Protocol Chaos 7. If the first attack had been confusing, the second phase was actively maddening. The Concordat fleet split into dozens of small groups, each one moving independently with no apparent coordination. Some groups attacked aggressively. Others retreated. Some held position and fired at random intervals. Several groups began fighting each other, broadcasting alerts about swarm infiltration and corruption, though no such infiltration existed. The third swarm wave emerged into complete chaos. The hive mind tried to process what it was seeing: Concordat forces that appeared to have lost all cohesion, fighting each other as much as the swarm, making decisions that contradicted moment to moment. It was a target-rich environment with no clear priority. Everything was both a threat and an opportunity. The swarm advanced, trying to capitalize on this apparent collapse, and that was when it entered the real killing field. The false battles between Concordat ships ceased instantly. Every vessel turned in perfect coordination and fired on the swarm units that had pushed deep into their formation, trusting the chaos to protect them. The small groups that had seemed scattered revealed themselves as perfectly positioned to envelop the enemy. The random movements had actually been herding the swarm into a carefully designed trap. "They're adapting," Torres said, watching the tactical displays. "Look there, they're pulling back, trying to regroup." "Let them," said. He was learning to think like general now, to see battles not as single engagements but as sequences of moves in a larger game. "Order Group Theta to pursue. Everyone else hold position." Group Theta consisted of older Concordat ships, some barely holding together, their weapons systems obsolete by current standards. They chased the retreating swarm units with apparent enthusiasm, firing ineffectively, accomplishing nothing. Except they were not meant to accomplish anything. They were bait. The swarm saw the weak pursuers and calculated. These ships could be destroyed easily. Destroying them would inflict casualties and gather data on Concordat vulnerabilities. The hive mind diverted forces to envelope and eliminate Group Theta. Now said quietly, the real strike force, modern Concordat vessels that had been positioned behind the nebula's densest gas clouds, emerged at full speed. They had been hidden using techniques Admiral had taught them, running silent, minimizing emissions, looking like nothing more than cosmic debris on sensors. The swarm had been so focused on the obvious prey that it had missed the actual predator. The strike force hit the swarm's repositioned units from behind while they were focused on destroying Group Theta. It was slaughter. By the time the hive mind recognized the threat and tried to redirect its forces, half of the third wave was gone. Group Theta did not escape unscathed. 6 ships were lost, their crews dying to sell the deception. Felt each loss like a physical blow. Before, he would have considered such sacrifice unthinkable. Now, he understood it as necessary. The pain of that understanding was something he would carry forever. Fourth wave, Tors said. Her voice was tight. She understood the cost too. They're not stopping. They never stop, replied. But neither will we. All ships pattern 5 make them afraid of ghosts. The battle continued for 18 hours. Wave after wave of swarm units poured through the gravitational channel, and each time the Concordat forces met them with tactics that made no sense. They attacked where attacks seemed suicidal. They retreated when they held advantages. They wasted ammunition on false targets. They broadcast conflicting orders that made their own coordination seem impossible. They did everything wrong, and in doing so, they did everything right. The Void Swarm's hive mind was designed to find patterns and exploit them. But humans had taught the Concordat to have no patterns. Every engagement was different. Every tactic contradicted the last. Every response prediction. The swarm adapted and adapted and adapted, but it was always adapting to something that no longer existed by the time its adaptations were complete. Finally, after losses that would have broken any Concordat force of the past, the swarm faltered. Its advance slowed, stopped, and then reversed. The hive mind had calculated something that its programming had never anticipated. It could not win, not against enemies who refused to behave in ways that could be predicted, analyzed, and countered. The Void Swarm retreated into dark space, leaving behind the wreckage of thousands of units, and the knowledge that the galaxy had learned to fight in ways it could not overcome. On the bridge of the Harmonious Dawn stared at the casualty reports. 37 ships lost, 4,000 crew dead. By old Concordat standards, it was a catastrophe. By the standards humans had taught him, it was victory. Send word to the Council, he said quietly. The swarm has been repelled. The threshold holds. Approached, his exoskeleton chiming a complex sequence that had learned meant profound mixed emotions. We won, Ambassador. At a cost, but we won. Yes, agreed. General would say we traded well. 4,000 lives to save billions. Tors placed a hand on his shoulder, a human gesture of comfort that he had come to appreciate. They died as warriors. They'll be remembered. They will, promised. Every one of them. We will build monuments. We will speak their names. We will ensure their sacrifice is never forgotten. He looked at the tactical displays showing the dispersing fleet. Ships damaged but functional. Crews exhausted but alive. A civilization that had been hours from annihilation now secure, at least for the moment. Major Tors, he said, send a message to General. Tell her the lessons have been learned. Tell her the Concordat knows now what it costs to survive. I will, Tors replied. She'll be proud of you, all of you. Will she, asked, or will she mourn what we have become? Both, Tors said honestly. That's what humans do. We're proud of victories and haunted by costs. You don't get one without the other. The fleet began the journey home, carrying the wounded and the fallen, bearing news of triumph purchased with blood. Behind them, the threshold nebula slowly dimmed as the gases settled, the colors fading as if the cosmos itself was acknowledging the day's grim work. Prepared his report to the council. He would tell them about the victory. He would explain the tactics. He would justify the losses. And he would make a recommendation that he knew would spark fierce debate.